Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. Apologies for those who were waiting for the live stream, but
technical difficulties.
Technical difficulties. I was going to say conditions outside our control, which are arguably within our control, have meant that we're unable to do it. So we'll try again next time. But for now, here's another lovely audio-only Free Kiwis recording. So why don't we just actually start by going around the room? So I'm here. I'm James. You probably heard my voice before. And Michael is next to me, the other host. And
Greetings.
we also have three distinguished guests today, which is wonderful. So maybe we could start with Matthew and then going around.
Sure thing. Matthew Birchall, Senior Fellow at the New Zealand Initiative, and I'm a historian by training.
We like historians.
Yeah, Bryce WIlkinson, also New Zealand Initiative Fellow, and my background is economics, so my interest in this subject relates to its implications for prosperity.
We like economists too.
Kendall, Clements, I'm a professor in biological sciences at the University of Auckland, and my interest in this is in the relationship between postmodernist ideology and science.
We very much like scientists.
We like fish biologists in particular. We know a few of them. Okay, so what we're here to discuss today is this book, Cynical Theories. On the cover it says Critical Theories, but the critical is crossed out and it says Cynical. And the subtitle is How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. So Helen Pluckrose, I should say, I have met once or twice in person. She used to be the editor-in-chief of Aereo, which is a magazine I wrote a few articles to.
Not forgetting that she's been on Free Kiwis.
Oh, of course, yeah. And she's also been on Free Kiwis, so you can go and listen to that, go back and listen to that episode. But the other thing people might be interested in is this so-called squared hoax.
Alain Sokal.
That's right. So the original hoax was by Alain Sokal, who was a physicist, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote an article which was sort of deliberately bad, deliberately included obvious mistakes, outright mistakes of mathematics and such things.
It was also contending that gravity is a culturally relative thing.
That's right.
The central thesis of his paper.
He sent it to this journal called Social Text, which is a kind of postmodern journal, and they just published it. And he said, aha, that shows you have no rigor.
And just to give that some context, it was in about 1990 this happened.
Yeah, quite a long time ago now. And I think their response, the response from the journal Social Text was something like, but doesn't it just show that all knowledge is constructed? Or something like that.
Well, they were actually angry with him. Instead of being embarrassed, they were very upset with him.
On the grounds that it was fraud, or?
I don't know, on the grounds that they were exposed as charlatans, I think.
Well, they probably didn't say that, but yeah.
No, they didn't.
But that brings us to this so-called squared thing, which is more recent. I think this is sort of 2017. So Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsay, the two authors of this book, and Peter Boghossian. It's called so-called squared because Sokal just had one paper, one deliberately kind of bad paper that he got published. These three actually wrote, they had a whole project. They had, I think, maybe a dozen papers, maybe even more.
They're obviously not mathematicians, though, because 1 squared is 1.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking that. It's not really squared. It's like sort of multiplied by lots.
Yeah.
Anyways, they had lots of more papers, and they didn't all get published, but many of them got published in sort of postmodern journals or journals in the spheres of what they called grievance studies. So some of these fields that we're going to be discussing today, like fat studies, post-colonial studies, queer studies. And again, a lot of these papers were sort of deliberately, they used made-up data that nobody checked. What else? One of them was a rewritten passage from Mein Kampf, just replacing the word Jews with white men, and nobody noticed that. So their point was basically that you can get published in a lot of journals which on the face of it are kind of respectable journals that will help you get promotion in academic life. You can get published in those journals as long as you have the right politics, but if you have no rigor, if your papers have no actual data behind them. So unless anyone wants to comment on that, maybe we'll just move on to the book.
Just a couple of things, James. So the article, the so-called hoax article, is called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. It was published in the journal Social Text in the spring-summer issue of 1996.
All right, thank you. Yeah. And I think that the so-called squared hoax, the write-up by the actual perpetrators, you might say, is in Aereo magazine a few years ago, 2017 or 18, I think. And that's worth reading because it actually has a summary of all the articles, and also it has the feedback they got from the journal editors. And in some cases, it was quite hilarious.
One of the papers was nominated for an award,
That's right.
I believe.
Got an award for the best paper in the field that year.
Mm.
So anyway, I guess Cynical Theories is the book in which two of these figures sort of try and put meat on the bones of their critique. That's a kind of the so-called squared hoax was kind of an experiment or like a game, a fun way of sort of suggesting that these journals have no rigor. But now they're actually going to tell us what they think of critical theory, what it is, or cynical theories, i.e. critical theory, postmodernism, and what's wrong with it and what could be put in its place. So let's start out with postmodernism, because the first chapter in the book, I think, is just called, after the introduction, is just called postmodernism. So does anyone want to have a go at saying either what Pluckrose and Lindsay think postmodernism is, or what you think it is, and whether it has, how it's changed over the years?
I think it's a pretty hard term to define, but they point out what I would say is one of its defining features, which is that everything is a language game. So they take it to be the case that because ideas are described in language, and this I think is its fundamental error, courtesy of Derrida, that language is somehow ungrounded in reality. I think that's the fundamental error of that analysis. It is true that language has an imperfect grounding in reality, because it's not reality itself, but a code by which we describe reality. But the fact that we have evolved to use language, and it's obviously enhanced our survivability, shows that it is correlated with reality to a sufficient degree to be advantageous. So that to me is the fundamental error of postmodernism.
So that goes right back to Saussure, right? This idea that a word like dog, the phonemes, so the particular sounds that go into the word dog, they actually have no connection to the object.
That's true.
And that's it's an interesting point.
Well,
it's
not true actually. The word doesn't resemble dog in any way. So the word dog doesn't in any way resemble the organism dog. But it's not true that it has nothing to do with dog, because it's used to refer to it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so it has nothing to do with it, just in the sense like there's no intrinsic reasons why dog has to refer
dog
to that
and not Xian or Hun.
And that's why we have multiple. Yeah. It's behind the fact that we have multiple languages. But then, as you say, they seem to take that and they really run with it to the point where it's like, languages in the world are completely separate, which seems kind of less justifiable.
It's obviously unjustifiable because words have reference in the world, and the world, we have concrete objects in the world that we have words for, and it obviously helps us communicate our experience of the world. And of course there are abstract words as well where the definitions are less secure and all of that, but in the end it's not true that language is somehow unhinged from reality, and that reality as we see it is entirely constructed through language. It's not. It's constructed for human beings through the way in which our bodies have evolved in complex interaction with our environments, just as is the case for any other organism. It's just that we've also evolved this tremendous symbolic method of communicating which no other organism has.
I think it's probably worth just briefly noting the historical context out of which postmodernism emerged, and in particular the strain that gets picked up by the Anglophone Academy in particular. So we're talking about a 1960s, 1970s, predominantly French school of thought. So Michael, you mentioned Derrida, we could throw in to the ring Foucault.
Certainly Foucault, he's referred to extensively in the book.
Exactly, and I think you're right. It's this kind of unmooring of language from reality, a sort of a language game. Language floats free from reality. But I think it's really important to note straight up that there was a sort of ironic dimension to this, the early evolution of postmodern thought, and that changes as it is picked up by the social justice movement, but I think important to acknowledge.
Okay, that's really good, because you're getting us on to what I wanted to talk about next, which is the sort of three phases that they outline in the postmodern movement. Before we do that, we've talked a lot so far about language, and I agree this is a crucial part of postmodernism, and Pluckrose and Lindsay also agree. Are there any other ideas that you associate, either the other two maybe associate with postmodernism, that you think it's important to get in here?
Well, I think you ought to mention their two principles.
Yeah, I was gonna come to that just next. So why don't you, if you have them there, why don't you go through those?
Well, Pluckrose and Lindsay come up with these two principles that they say define postmodernism. The first one is the postmodern knowledge principle. I'm quoting here. Radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable, and a commitment to cultural constructivism. And Michael will, after I finish, tell us about cultural constructivism. And the second one is the postmodern political principle, which is a belief that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies which decide what can be known and how.
All right, Michael's going to tell us. We have a prediction that Michael's going to tell us.
Well, what I will say is that the first of those things connects to the whole language game idea, the idea that that truth is elusive. Because if you accept, first of all, that language is unhindered from reality and that human experience is mediated by language, then human experience has no fundamental correspondence with reality.
Right.
And different cultures construct it in different ways because they have different languages. I think that's the corollary to that.
Yeah, I sort of agree with both of you. I think that language is how postmodernism started, because I think it's, I tried to drive it all ultimately from Saussure's course of linguistics. Like, I think a lot of it goes back to that. So I think this belief in the power of language and the sort of separateness of language, the sort of unreality of language, that really lies at the core of what a lot of postmodernists have been doing for a long time.
But the other thing the other defining thing that Kendall mentioned there is the idea that everything is a power relationship.
That's right. So I was going to say, but there are these other things going on. Postmodernism is kind of complicated. There are lots of different themes. So we might put the linguistic thing as a principle, or sort of more explicitly weave it into that first postmodern knowledge principle. But they have those as the two principles. The political thing you just mentioned, Michael, that everything's about power and hierarchy. The postmodern knowledge or epistemic principle about radical skepticism about objective knowledge. And then what they have are these four themes. So I'll read the four themes of postmodernism. One of them is actually the power of language, which we've been talking about a lot already, which we think is probably the core of it. Another one is the blurring of boundaries. This idea that there are kind of binaries that are set up. Often it's said that sort of Western culture has established these binaries, but actually there's slippage, as Derrida says, I think, between these binaries, and they break down, and things are more complicated than that. We see this a lot with the sex and gender debate. Another theme is cultural relativism, which you've already talked about. So if there's no such thing as objective knowledge, then every culture has its own truth, and that's equally valid, or whatever language you want to use around that. And the final theme is the loss of the individual and the universal. So I think that one is about sort of, again, this cultural relativism, and then the individual kind of gets read through group allegiance, right? You're not a historian, you're not Matthew Birchall, you're just a ginger, or you're a historian, and that says everything about you. So I have to address you as, I know you're looking at this as a historian or as a ginger. And you might, if you're sort of a liberal individual, you might say, no, actually, I think about it as a person who has thoughts and, reaches conclusions. But no, you're a member of a group, so that's that's a very postmodern thing as well, I think.
Do you think Foucault would have agreed with that?
With the group thing, I'm not sure actually.
Not with the individual, because I think that comes in later at the second phase.
Yeah,
I think
I'd
you're
agree,
right, Kendall. I think that's true.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go back to the phases then, because Matthew brought this up helpfully before. So in my notes, I hope I've gotten this right. They outline these three phases. The first one is called the high deconstructive period, which I think goes from sort of the 60s to the 80s. Then there's what they call applied postmodernism, which sort of starts to come in the 90s. And then the third and final phase of this is what they call social justice scholarship. So does anyone want to sort of describe those three in more detail briefly?
I think we should read what they say. I've got a quote here.
Go ahead, yeah.
So this is from page 246 of my Kindle edition. I've got both a hard copy and I read it on Kindle. So I'm quoting here. To understand how the three phases of postmodernism have developed, imagine a tree with deep roots in radical leftist social theory. The first phase, or high deconstructive phase, from the 1960s to the 1980s, usually simply referred to as postmodernism, gave us the tree trunk, theory, and they capitalized the theory. The second phase, from the 1980s to the mid-2000s, which we call applied postmodernism, gave us the branches, the more applicable theories and studies, including post-colonial theory, queer theory, critical race theory, gender studies, fat studies, disability studies, and many critical anything studies. In the current third phase, which began in the mid-2000s, theory has gone from being an assumption to being the truth, a truth that is taken for granted. And they call the third phase reified postmodernism.
Mm.
By reified, they mean theory made real.
And I guess
Okay.
that connects to it invading all the public institutions and taking over the universities and public service, and not a few corporations through their HR departments.
So,
Yep.
so Kendall, reified is what I call the social justice phase. So there's high deconstructive, applied, and then reified, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't, because they are saying,
Oh, I mean, it doesn't matter as long as it's clear, I guess, that there's this. The high deconstructive phase is like this very playful phase.
yeah,
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
suddenly it's like, no, we actually have to apply this to the world. And then it sort of seems to further harden into, we're not just applying this in a kind of humble way as one view among others. It is the truth with a capital T.
okay, so one thing that I would like to mention is that two much more recent books, Against Decolonization by Doug Stokes and The Identity Trap by Yasha Monk, both also present this as a three-stage development.
Okay.
But they both, Stokes and Yasha Monk, both relate this much more directly to particular individuals. And they relate the first phase to mainly Foucault, but also Derrida to some extent, and there are others like Lyotard and so on.
Mm.
The second phase, they relate directly to post-colonial scholarship, and that's people like Edward Said, and she was from India originally, but and Said was actually from Palestine, I think. But both of them ended up, when they were publishing, they were based at universities in the States. And the second one is the Gayatri Spivak. So these are the two post-colonial scholars. And then the third phase relates to the development of the inclusion of things like intersectionality from Kimberlé Crenshaw, critical race theory from Derek Bell, and so on. And it's very interesting that these three separate books have all come up with, you can essentially map them all onto the same structure if you.
So I'm interested in hearing, if people think that these three phases are broadly correct, so I'm actually interested in hearing some lived experience, as the phrase is. Like, have you, because you're all, well-educated gentlemen, have you had experience of this either in the university sector or in the public sector, or as, a think tank intellectual, any of these phases? How have they affected you?
I might have a crack. So
Yeah.
I think the genealogy is spot on. And if I look at my own field of colonial history, when I'm doing my graduate studies, I'm very much aware of, a tradition of scholarship dating from the 90s, both in history, but also very prominently in literature, anthropology and the like, that is, interested in questions of race and very much in the shadow of Said's Orientalism. But it was sort of kind of discreet. It was a debate among academics for the most part, and of course the students that would attend their classes, but it was somewhat restricted, and I saw the movement from that second stage to the third stage of taking on another sort of normative dimension and it becoming much more all-encompassing. And I think it's that movement from post-colonial theory to critical race theory, where the claims become much, much grander, and there's a really strong normative impulse. And, this has been I think very sort of pervasive in the humanities. I'm interested to hear what Kendall has to say about the sciences, but I very much saw that as I was studying. And the interesting thing for me is, a scholar who likes to be in the archives and do quite sort of empirical, old-fashioned work, is just how out of touch the work I was doing, and the default mode of scholarship today is to really centre these categories of race. If you're not explicitly addressing a topic through that social justice framework, you're very much off to the side. Whereas I think that second stage, there was more flexibility and room for manoeuvre. You could do the old-fashioned imperial history, or you could do post-colonial history. There was a restriction, a tightening going on.
I'm interested to hear from Bryce actually about the impact of these ideas on economics. Do you think there's been a direct impact on economic theory of postmodern ideas?
It's more about public dialogue, I think, that, I did my academic work career in the 1960s, 1970s, and of course none of this was impinging on reality or discussions about where the wealth of nations came from and how it happened in such a short period of time, industrial revolution. But in recent years, of course, it's been affecting the whole public dialogue. What I first started noticing was, the Roger Douglas reforms and the enormous sort of unreflective animosity towards them from sociology departments. And now sort of almost anything I see coming out of the social sciences other than economics, where it relates to public policy, starts off with a rant about neoliberalism, which is commonly undefined and sort of not closely related to what's happening.
So am I right in thinking that what you're really saying is that these ideas may not have impinged directly on economic theory, but they certainly impinge on the way in which economic policy is discussed, and how, for example, it is purported to affect different identity groups?
Yes, very much so. The only overlap with my time in the 60s is the Marxist theory, where individualism was vanished, and you're a member of a class, and that was the only thing which was relevant about you. You were an exploiter class, or you were the exploited. But I think, the one-line summary now, Oliver got right some time ago, it's that public discourse in the West, the wealthy countries, has lost sight of what made the West prosperous. And that's really troubling.
Well, one thing that you raised there, Bryce, I do want to get back to sort of other stories about how this has affected people, but one thing you raised there is Marxism, which I think is actually kind of a point of controversy even among people who are trying to sort of analyze critical theories from a critical lens, whether these postmodern theories are linked to Marxism or whether they go against Marxism. I have a sense that technically a lot of these guys weren't especially Marxist. I think they were broadly of the left, though. I mean, Foucault, I think, is clearly some kind of...
There's a way in which they're explicitly not Marxists, in that Marxism has this kind of grand narrative about the progress of history towards the socialist ideal, whereas these people reject any such grand narrative. Although,
that's true.
Yeah, one could argue that they've reinvented a grand narrative now in this, what Pluckrose and Lindsay called the reification stage.
I think it's the loss of individual agency is the common theme, but you're quite right. The Marx dialectic materialism is not part of the things we're talking about today.
Well, I think that the what Lindsay and Pluckrose call the postmodern political principle, the idea that society is all about power and hierarchies, you can see obvious connections with Marxism there. I think that, but basically because a lot of these...
class.
Yeah, It's not based on class, but it's based on race and sex instead.
Other identity groups.
So instead of having like the bourgeoisie as or whoever's meant to be the oppressing class, you have like men, identity groups or white men as the oppressor class.
Heterosexual people, etc.
I think
James Lindsay has actually gone further more recently on his website. He's said that a lot of these things are, or critical race theory in particular, is race Marxism. So it's Marxism, but instead of having classes, you just use races.
Yeah.
Matthew?
No, I was just thinking of Chris Trotter here, because I see him as someone that would hew more closely to a traditional Marxian kind of framework, but he has no time for any of this social justice stuff.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that there's a natural kind of, as Michael was suggesting, there's almost like a natural competition between these different ways of looking at things, because if you think it's all about class, then you're not going to agree that it's all about race, right?
Yeah.
I guess that's where the intersectionality thing comes in.
Yeah, exactly. Then you can try and have like a grand theory. Kendall, were you going to say something?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. So Yeshe Monk has an appendix in The Identity Trap where he explains why this isn't Marxism. And it has to do with the fact that Marxism was very much a product or an Enlightenment project, whereas postmodernism is a reaction against the Enlightenment. And I think he's right. And if you go back to earlier people who are kind of referred to as post-structuralists like Adorno and Horkheimer, who fled Germany in the 1930s and went to the States, part of their concern was they were seeing in Nazism kind of what they saw as the ultimate sort of a-religious society that was entirely based on science. And this is where, and I think this is kind of picked up by Foucault, that there's a very, very deep mistrust of science in this stuff. And we see this flowing right through into today. And even in the last couple of days, a tweet from Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. Did you see that?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, I will read you the tweet. I don't want to get off topic here, but so he said, there is a major flaw in Western universities that causes science to become a tool in the hands of the Zionist powers. Now, by Zionist, this is Khomeini, right? He has a Twitter account. So by Zionist powers, just read Western powers.
Yeah, so that's very reminiscent of Edward Said, isn't it? This idea that not so much science in his case, but scholarship. What the Westerners were doing in the great encyclopedic project when the French were in Egypt, for example, or all sort of Western study of Muslim cultures has been a kind of project of attaining power. Whereas actually, you might look at it in a completely different light. You might think, well, that's quite nice that Westerners are studying other cultures because then they learn more about them and it brings people more together. I mean, that seems to be like a more natural way of taking it. But you're right that there's this idea that because knowledge is power, we have to be very suspicious of knowledge.
It's interesting that idea that it was the refugees from Nazism who started to see science with suspicion. I think there's something simpler than that, actually, which is that science holds to the idea that there is an objective truth. It doesn't, of course, seriously think that we can fully attain it, and that's the Popperian idea rather than the previous positivist idea that we could eventually arrive at the absolute truth through scientific methods. That idea had been dropped by the 20th century, and Karl Popper formulated the idea of contesting ideas and with evidence and forming ever better representations of reality, but never quite getting there. But nonetheless, to scientists, there is a way things are, and we're groping towards it to the best of our ability. So if you take a completely relativist stance, as the postmodernists do, then that scientific idea of objective reality is anathema.
I almost want to rewrite the famous C.P. Snow lecture on the two cultures. Instead of the arts and sciences, it's science and the postmodernists. That seems to be more fruitful for our thinking today.
Right.
Yeah, and the postmodernists have apparently won in a lot of areas of life. But let me take it back to this sort of our experiences of these things, because I can remember I was an undergraduate at Oxford studying classics. This is in the early 2000s, and we were aware of postmodern theories. They were out there. I think people just thought they were kind of crazy and they wouldn't really affect anything. However, I think as I was studying there, there was this move to introduce sort of more literary theory into classics. And then, interestingly, what happened, I think, was that the sort of old guard who would kind of thunderously denounce postmodernism, they started to look sort of, they started to look old-fashioned. They started to look closed-minded. And I think that postmodernism sort of came through because of that. It's a kind of a tough bind, because you want to have free speech, you want to be open-minded. At the same time, if someone's writing complete bunk, you've got to be able to say so, right? So I think that's kind of a strategic consideration, which in those early days I think won a lot of victories for postmodernism. But I think that even in the early 2000s, definitely if you go back further in the 90s, it was still quite playful. Like, it still had a sense of humor. Everything was deconstructed. Nothing really meant anything. It was really only, mainly in literary theory and things like that it was operative. And then things got more serious. I remember I went to Stanford, started to do my PhD in classics, but I was on the ancient history track. And because I was on the ancient history track, I had to do, there was a compulsory seminar in the history department about theory of history. And there's lots of theory of history out there that I knew of, which wasn't on the syllabus, right? Because it was all about Foucault, and we read a lot of Foucault, and we read Edward Said, and it was definitely the first class that I'd been in where I got the sense from the professor and from the other graduate students that you weren't really meant to criticize the readings, right? You weren't really meant to say, oh, the reading says this, but I disagree with it. That didn't go down well. It was very much like, this is the way you should look at things, and it was kind of a shock. But I think the more time I've spent in academia, outside of classics at Oxford in the early 2000s, which is a while away now, the more I've seen this as a kind of orthodoxy.
It's where the whole thing hits a paradox, isn't it? You're not supposed to disagree with it, even though nothing is true.
Yeah, but that's the thing. That's exactly what they say. Is like, in theory, it's nothing is true, but then you go through these phases and you arrive at this conclusion where it's like, nothing that you say is true. You can't appeal to evidence, but everything that we say is true. It's like.
So, question for you, James: what happens in the culture that allows this to become an orthodoxy? Is it a question of the institutional setup of universities, or is it something larger?
I think what I was saying before is kind of an interesting thing. Like, I think this is sort of asymmetry in tactics, which is that the sort of centrists and the generally liberal leftists at universities have genuinely been pretty open-minded because they don't want to sound like some kind of and because it's good in itself, right? Mm-hmm. And they've said, okay, let's have postmodernism stuff. And I think that often, especially in recent years, the really kind of gung-ho postmodernists have not extended that charity in the other direction, right? So I think that this is sort of a separate topic from the actually intellectual roots of this, but my sense is that they have been quite aggressive about hiring people that they agree with, maybe not always sort of renewing the contracts of people they disagree with. And so if you have one side doing that and the other being all high-minded, then the inevitable result is that, the people who are being high-minded and fair-minded are going to get crowded out.
Mm-hmm. I think that's too charitable to the traditional academics, who I think have been utter cowards, actually. I think you can take a high-minded, as you put it, approach. If you're rigorous about it and forthright about it, then you represent the kind of classical liberal or Enlightenment project well, and you're likely to persuade people with the strength of your arguments. But if you cower because you're scared of being called all kinds of names like racist or sexist or homophobic or the whole litany, and don't act as you should as a scholar of the Enlightenment, that's when you cede the ground to the bad faith of those who want to control the discourse.
Yes, I think in that sense, these centrists, if that's the word, have been high-minded in giving the floor to postmodernists, and they've been principled in saying you can have free speech, But then when they see people getting bullied who have another view, they haven't always been high-minded about stepping in and saying, this is wrong, you have to allow those people to speak as well.
Which calls into question the extent to which they are high-minded about the first thing, rather than just going with the flow or trying to get on with whatever they wanted to study without worrying about the bigger picture.
Yeah, which actually I think maybe we can bring Kendall in here because, well, Bryce has already said it hasn't really hit economics in quite the way it's hit other fields, but it's had some effect maybe through Marxism. But Kendall, so these things have come to the fish biologists too, right? It's just to hard scientists.
I don't know. Well, they're certainly affecting science. But just to bring it back to the book that we're supposed to be talking about, I'd like to read you a quote that sort of captures where some of the tensions are. So this is from pages 83 to 84 of the Kindle edition of Cynical Theories. Quote, in the words of Professor of Indigenous Education at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, and this is a quote from Linda Smith, it's actually the first two lines of the introduction of decolonizing methodologies. From the vantage point of the colonized, a position from which I write and choose to privilege, the term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. The word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary, end quote. So now back to so this is that's the bit of decolonizing methodologies that Pluckrose and Lindsay quoted. And then they say, it is unclear how this attitude is likely to help people in the Indigenous world, which, barring the decolonization of time, also happens to have entered the 21st century. Ultimately, research justice amounts to judging scholarly productions not by their rigor or quality, but by the identity of their producer, and privileging those understood by post-colonial theory as marginalized as long as they are advocating knowledge production methods and conclusions that conform to those of post-colonial theory. This is an understandable move for postmodernists who deny that there can be any objective criteria of rigor or quality, only those that have been privileged and those that have been marginalized. But in science, including social science, there is an objective criterion of quality, namely correspondence to reality. Some scientific theories work and others don't. It is hard to see how scientific theories that don't correspond with reality and consequently don't work can benefit marginalized people or anyone. So that's pages 83, 84. So that's Pluckrose and Lindsay on this tension between postmodernist, or in this particular case, post-colonialist ideology and science.
Right, okay. I mean, so yeah, if we want to sort of complete our discussion of the book, I mean, the middle chapters, I'm not sure how much you want to talk about these, but I'll just note for people who haven't read the book. Basically, we have this introduction that we've just started, we've just talked about, which introduces us to postmodernism, what it is, and the three phases that they outline. And then we go into these chapters, which are really about discrete fields of postmodern theory. So we have post-colonial theory, a whole chapter, queer theory, another chapter, and then we have critical race theory and intersectionality, feminisms and gender studies, disability and fat studies. And then we go into the kind of concluding section of the book. Do we want to talk about any of these particular ones? I mean...
Well, one thing that they do really well, I think, is to tease out the different roots of each of these, what can we call them, sub-theories or applications to different aspects of human identity, whether it's sexuality or race or the rest of it. And some of them are certainly a little more coherent than others. I mean, when you read the one about sexuality, for example, you very quickly encounter Judith Butler, who made an art form of obscurantism, and very difficult to understand anything that she writes. In fact, she's renowned for writing sentences a page long. Whereas I think...
She's won an award for the worst academic sentence.
Yeah,
right. I think something like critical race theory, while I think it makes very, very dubious assertions, is much more tractable to understand. I think, though, that at the core of all of these things is a kind of catch-22, which is to say not only are they unfalsifiable in scientific terms, they also act in bad faith in the sense that if you criticise them, that is taken to be evidence for the thesis itself. Because, for example, if as a white man you criticise critical race theory or gender theory, that is taken to be you exercising your privilege against the oppressed category du jour.
Actually, that aspect of it does kind of remind me of Marxist ideology, that they have these sort of...
the false consciousness idea.
Yeah, exactly. These ways of immunizing themselves from any criticism. So if if you're a working class person who disagrees with Marxism, you're exhibiting false consciousness. So these other ones, I mean, I think it's tempting often to sort of look at these individual fields and say one of them is kind of the one that rules them all. But, I mean, another way of thinking about it is like, which of these themes that Pluckrose and Lindsay identify are most prominent in each of these fields? And I think queer theory for me is very much the one of the blurring of boundaries. As I said before, it's this idea that there are these male and female categories which seem natural. And I personally think they are natural, and there's lots of scientific evidence to suggest that they're natural in humans and other mammal species and other species.
Other species that go back a long way before
but
mammals.
So there's this idea that actually, there's something too kind of Western or clear cut or black and white about these categories, and we have to dissolve them. And that's why we get this idea of, gender is a spectrum rather than, bimodal distribution or whatever. And, it's all sort of blurred into this continuum. Birchall, you want to say something?
No, I'm just nodding in agreement because I think, the genderqueer chapter is illustrative of theory taken to its real extreme, right? And the sort of dissolution of boundaries.
And some of these I think lend themselves more to this kind of analysis in terms of Marxism or extreme egalitarianism. I think sort of disability and fat studies one is very much one where it's trying to say, there's nothing wrong with being extremely obese. The hope is that if you talk about it in a different way, then things are going to be more equal for these folks. And so again, you see this emphasis on language as well, right? The way we talk about it is the most important thing.
There's no such thing as anything objectively unhealthy.
Exactly.
So being grossly obese is only unhealthy if the public discourse about it says that it is and marginalizes those people.
Exactly. And if you say it's unhealthy, that feeds back into this the political principle of post-modernism, which is that everything's hierarchy and power. So the only reason that people are saying that it's unhealthy is to sort of repress and oppress people who are obese. Whereas, going back to Kendall's point, or the bit that Kendall read from the book, you might actually think that one way of thinking about obesity and helping people who are obese is to actually study it empirically and look at the health effects of being obese and the kinds of interventions that are more successful in helping people lose weight, etc.
That's where you run across immediately the kind of circular logic of these discourses, because if you bring to bear empirical evidence, then you are being hegemonic in your thinking, taking a scientific viewpoint which is informed by, Western cultural hegemony and all too many white men and so on.
Yeah. All right, anyone want to say something else about any of the other chapters in this bit of the book, the central bit of the book?
I won't say anything about any one in particular, but at a higher level, I think the real achievement of these discrete chapters is exactly as Michael alluded to, very careful mapping out of all the permutations, and you can follow, say, how post-colonial theory, the set of arguments develops over time, and I think that's a real achievement given how obscure and poorly written a lot of this stuff is, and that's what I really took away. And if listeners haven't read the book, I think it's a wonderful primer to just dip into one chapter or the other.
They're also careful not to completely deny the problems that the theorists are drawing attention to. So, of course, as you'd know as a colonial historian, it's not as if colonisation was a completely benign activity. It was not.
Yeah.
It had its genocidal moments. It certainly had a lot of oppression involved on the basis of race. So it's not as if there's no issue there that needed to be addressed.
That's absolutely right, and it circles back to that distinction that they make in the opening chapter between social justice with capitals and social justice without, and without capitals is this sort of liberal commitment, and that's an honourable and worthwhile endeavour, but it's when it becomes reified in the way it has that you get into all these problems. So you're absolutely right to point that out, Michael.
Okay, so this is all a good segue to the final third of the book. I guess this book has 3 phases, kind of like postmodernism according to the book. And the last phase is kind of concluding thoughts, and it kind of does what Matthew just did a moment ago. It sort of looks back at all these discrete studies of different so-called grievance studies fields, and it tries to find some generalities. So they have a chapter called Social Justice Scholarship and Thought. I guess that's really about just the latest phase, but it's also on a more general level. So one of the things that they see there is something that Michael's already mentioned, that there's basically no agreeing with it, right? No disagreeing with it. If you disagree with it, that shows that you're one of the body snatchers, you're one of the evil aliens, or you have to be opposed rather than placated or even sort of
argued with
in the way that we might associate with more traditional scholarship. And another thing is also this standpoint of epistemology. Have we gone into that? Maybe not explicitly, but it's sort of a similar idea to cultural relativism, that there's no objective truth. There's no kind of God's eye view of everything. Instead, it's just, what do you think as a Canadian? What do you think as a fish biologist? I mean, actually, what you think as a fish biologist might actually make a bit more sense. It's usually these pure identity categories, right? What do you think as a white man?
Well, it's relevant if you're talking about fish biology.
Yeah, exactly.
Less so if you're talking about, cosmology or something.
Yeah, and I think there's actually a narrow sense in which it's true that there are obviously some things that you can talk about more if you're a woman or if you're a man, right? Like experience of being pregnant. I mean, I know I'm probably going to get canceled for saying this, but that's something that only women go through. Yeah. So it makes sense to defer to women on that experience. But there are so many other fields of life where it doesn't really matter that much. Or also, like there are various fields of life where someone who it doesn't matter where they're from or what they look like, they may just have accumulated a lot of knowledge about that particular subject, right? And it may even be something like gynecology, and you may end up knowing more about women's bodies than women do. And similarly, you may end up as an outsider or a foreign scholar, you may end up knowing more about a particular culture than representatives or supposed representatives of that culture.
And I think this emphasis on standpoint gets us away from the professional commitment we have as scholars to just do good work. One of the challenges for a scholar is to write something surprising and challenge your thinking, and you shouldn't be defined by your particular standpoint. So, going back to what you were saying earlier, James, it shouldn't much matter if I'm a ginger historian. That shouldn't have much bearing on what I write.
Well, they might say that being a ginger does, but not being an historian, because if you're going to deconstruct all of the epistemic methodologies like science and history and so on, then there's nothing left for those disciplines to say. But because you're a ginger, you're discriminated against, and so that gives you a standpoint to speak about the effect of hair colour on your social treatment.
I yearn for a pre-Enlightenment model, and that's Machiavelli. So he's just been castigated exiled from Florence, and he's trying to make ends meet, and he's working in the fields, toiling away. But every evening he would, and there's a wonderful description, he would don his robes and he would have 3 hours where he could commune with the past and do his work. And I love that, because it's sort of getting at, moving from your standpoint, your very physical standpoint, to just doing hard intellectual work
through the lens of a discipline.
Yeah.
So these are all sort of general features of these fields, and then the two last chapters of the book. So one of them is called Social Justice in Action, and this actually takes us back to the effects that they see as having, as postmodernism is having had on academia and then the wider world. Wonder if Kendall, do you want to talk about that, because this brings us back to sort of impact on university systems. Have you seen some of that?
Yes. I mean, I was just thinking about the relationship between cultural or social relativism or constructivism and standpoint epistemology, because you get into this position where you'll be told you cannot possibly understand the experiences of somebody who's, say, not white and not male. And I think that view has really pervaded universities to the extent that it's now very hard to have a simple good faith conversation about many topics, because you simply get painted out of the picture if you're not of the right stripe, to put it that way. And it's just, I mean, all of this, you keep coming back to these themes of cultural relativism, the idea that objective truth doesn't exist, that knowledge is socially constructed, and this is what Pluckrose and Lindsay call the postmodern knowledge principle. And then you get into the political principle. I'll just read you a bit, which is from page 246 to 247 of the Kindle edition, where they say, social justice scholarship does not merely present the postmodern knowledge principle that objective truth does not exist and knowledge is socially constructed and a product of culture, and the postmodern political principle, society is constructed through knowledge by language and discourses designed to keep the dominant in power over the oppressed. It treats them as the truth, tolerates no dissent, and expects everyone to agree or be cancelled. We see this in the obsessive focus on who can produce knowledge, and how in the explicit desire to infect as many other disciplines as possible with social justice methods. This is reflected in a clear wish to achieve epistemic and research justice by asserting that rigorous knowledge production is just a product of white, male, and Western culture, and thus no better than the theoretically interpreted lived experiences of members of marginalized groups, which must be constantly elevated and foregrounded. That's pages 246 to 247. And colleagues of mine have actually said things like, our place is just to sit and listen. And
on quite high salaries.
Well, yeah, that too. But I don't know how you can run a university along these lines, because essentially you're saying knowledge is kind of whatever you want it to be.
Exactly. And then there's no expertise. And I'm not saying that experts should sort of directly rule the universe or anything. There's obviously a big role for popular input as well.
That's why scholars argue with one another and present evidence.
Well, exactly. But at the very least, though,
and that's why they're having a university,
as Michael says, you're actually hiring people. I mean, you're usually hiring people with PhDs, usually selecting them fairly rigorously. You're expecting them to kind of show that they know things by publishing and teaching. So is that just all bunk? Because if the only important thing is kind of what your personal experience is, then yeah, as Kendall said, we might as well just hire university lecturers by sortition. Just randomly choose people off the street.
One of the things that took me aback, and this is about 4 or 5 years ago, when I'd recently become associate dean in education, I attended some university meeting of head honchos, and it was the first time I'd heard the contention that merit was a bad basis for selecting people for positions, and that was put forward quite unashamedly, and I was sort of taken aback, to say the least. And I said, well, if you don't like merit, what about competence as a different word? If you don't like the word merit, and there was just silence. like clearly I'd said the wrong thing. They don't want either merit or competence. What became very evident over the next little while was what they were after was certain identity categories, that we needed more people of colour and more women and all the usual lineup.
Yeah, so that's this radical egalitarian concern again. Like we need equal numbers of people.
Well, so there was nothing egalitarian about it because they didn't want to treat people equally. They wanted to.
Yeah, but they think egalitarianism means sort of equal
outcomes
in terms of numbers.
I mean, in a way, they got what they wanted. Right?
Well, actually, they don't even want equal outcomes. What they want to do is stack the deck in favour of certain categories, and my evidence for that is that nobody makes any fuss whatsoever about the fact that nearly 2/3 of graduates are female. You never hear anyone in the education system talking about the fact that boys are doing less well than girls at every stage of education. So they don't want equal outcomes, actually. They want good outcomes for their favoured categories. That's my contention.
This is the Ibram X. Kendi idea that you can't be an anti-racist without essentially pushing things back in the other direction. So it's more or less just sort of flipping everything over.
Yeah.
So you're still retaining it's not the same as an oppressed binary, but it's effectively just saying, well, now it's our turn. But just getting back to the point about universities, and this relates to merit as well, obviously, but if there's no such, if experience doesn't count for anything, then expertise doesn't count for anything. And if expertise doesn't count for anything, then why the hell go to university at all?
Well, so that you can practice your postmodern theory, I guess.
Well, what you mean, go on sort of inquisitorial hunts through...
You've got to train the Inquisition somewhere, Kendall.
Well, yeah, I'd like to think we're actually have a slight greater degree of responsibility for society.
Well, of course, they don't see it like that. They see it as they're enacting justice. But I mean, that's the dangerous thing. I mean, so many horrible things have been done in the past by people thinking that they had a monopoly on justice and truth, right? So it hasn't gotten as dark as it has in some other places and periods. But I think we should know enough at this point from history to be a little bit skeptical of that kind of thinking. But I mean, I do think that in democracies, I mean, this is probably because of my background, someone studied ancient Greek democracy, there is a place for, popular input and also, random involvement of citizens in decisions that are political in nature and moral in nature. What should we do or what ought we to do? But it seems pretty obvious that in lots of spheres of life, we want to actually cultivate excellence, where excellence means being better at a particular task or being, getting closer to reality. I mean, I have an anecdote too along those lines that when I think this is the meeting I was the representative from Victoria University to the Australasian Society for Classical Studies. And they had this problem that they brought up, which was that they had a Latin and Greek unseen competition, which basically means you get a bit of Latin or Greek and you have to translate it without any preparation or any dictionary. So it's pretty hard. And the problem was, it seemed, I don't know if they put it in exactly these terms, but it emerged during the course of this meeting that the problem was that this was being won year after year by private boys' schools in Sydney.
Because they were still teaching Latin.
Well, exactly. And someone read out the statistics and saying, this particular boys' school in Sydney has won 3 years in a row. There was a pause. And I said, good on them. Because I thought, isn't that fantastic? They're obviously training these boys really, really well to learn Latin and Greek. I'm a classicist. I want people to learn Latin and Greek to a high level. I think that's a good thing. Therefore, they're doing a good job. Everyone else should be trying to catch up, right? But no. The problem was that it was an unequal distribution of winning, even in this really kind of, to be honest, irrelevant area of life now, which isn't very glamorous or it's not going to make you much money. But even that was kind of intolerable. So. All right, we almost through an hour. Let's just finish up. The one last thing I wanted to talk about is the final chapter of this book, and we touched upon this already, but we should explicitly state it, partly because, especially with Helen Pluckrose, we have to understand where she is coming from, which is not necessarily a rejection of all things kind of liberal left. So what the final chapter, they offer an alternative to the ideology of social justice. Does anyone want to talk about what they see as the alternative?
Well, liberal democracy, basically.
Yeah, and they also talk about sort of liberal epistemology, which I'm not sure is the correct term, but what do they mean by that?
Well, I think it means a classical liberal interpretation. I mean, you can think of it broadly as the sorts of thinking that came to the fore during the Enlightenment. We certainly wouldn't say that science or democracy or any of these ideas had their roots in the Enlightenment, but there was definitely a step change at that point in history where especially the power of organised religion to suppress those things and also of autocratic governments to suppress those things fell away, and liberalism in the classical sense came to the fore. And here I'd be interested in your reflections again, Bryce. You're interested in prosperity, so am I, and it seems to me that the forces that were enabled at that point were hugely conducive to greater prosperity, whether it was democracy or more open economics or science. All of those things contributed to a society that then underwent a couple of centuries of the greatest economic growth in human history.
Yeah, the much despised and derided idea of Victorian values of a belief in individual autonomy and hard work, and responsible sort of behaviour, being part of civil society, savings and the like would get you ahead, is sort of submerged. I think of all the ideas, really, the most evil one is the intersectionality one, which is so pervasive. And the essence of that idea is that almost everyone's a victim, and they've been impressed by this power. And that sort of, I think it's just awful really telling young Maori kids who are struggling without literacy and numeracy that they're victims. It's an oppressive society. All the institutions are against them. And how demotivating is that for someone who wants to get ahead?
Or if they are motivated, they're motivated by revenge instead of the kind of motives that would improve their lives.
And then, that's the other side of it, that then there's sort of anger and a feeling of superiority. And I thought Marama Davidson's reaction to the Posner, an assault on a female, a suppression of not only her ability to speak, but of all the listeners who wanted to listen to what she had. And Marama was on an absolute high about this when she was interviewed, and saw herself as special because she was part of the people of the land, the people who came here first. And that's sort of an odd juxtaposition, isn't it? That victimhood oppressed by power, but we are superior and morally virtuous.
Nietzsche wrote about this. He called it ressentiment, which is a slightly different take on resentment. It's a kind of political level of resentment, I think, and the idea that victimhood is elevated to the highest value.
Yeah, and triumphalism seem to be part of that as well. I think the biggest worry I have is our Supreme Court appearing to favour social justice over justice. And I think the two are likely incompatible, and the loss of a sense of justice is an incredible loss.
So to return to the solution, is it just to maintain the line, to hold the line on classical liberalism and its institutions, an impartial Supreme Court that maintains the rule of law, as I say, impartially with respect to anybody's personal characteristics, an impartial set of disciplines represented in our universities, whether it's science or history or economics or anything else, that decides through argument and evidence the most tenable position at any given time, provisionally, because new evidence and new arguments can always intervene. A democracy where everybody's view can be represented, and where we have a method of selecting people for power that is first of all impermanent. They can always be thrown out if they turn out to be bad, and they can be thrown out by peaceful means. So in other words, all of the institutions that we developed over the last couple of 100 years that again, I would say have resulted in the most prosperous period in human history.
I think all those things are good. I mean, one thing I kind of want to add, though, is that there's also a lot of room in this book if you want to have left liberal solutions to these policy issues. And I say that not because I agree with Helen Pluckrose on all these issues, but just to say the book isn't necessarily saying you have to be on the political right. It's not saying you have to be in favor of the free market.
But classical liberalism isn't on the political right.
Okay, you can say that's a centrist position, but I mean, just so there were no misunderstandings, especially about Helen Pluckrose's politics. And I think that what she thinks is that she's probably some kind of sort of soft left Labour voter, and she thinks that government spending and government programs can help with some of these issues. She thinks that there is still racism in the UK and the US. There are obviously issues to deal with about post-colonialism and so on and so forth. So the point of the book isn't you all have to take a particular view of policy. The point is just that whatever view of policy you take, that you think is going to deal with some of these problems, it doesn't help anybody to think about it in this sort of weird way where, there's no up and down and truth doesn't really exist, right?
Right.
Well, and everything has to be painted as you're either an oppressor or the oppressed.
Yeah.
This is not from the book. This is from a 2021 book chapter by the AUT academic Georgina Tuari Stewart. And I'm just going to read it to you, and then I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on it, because this picks up on a number of these things. She says, relativism is far more nuanced than Young admits and ranges from weak to strong. Relativism objects to and seeks to ameliorate the imperialist consequences of universalism, since commitment to universalism ultimately denies the right to cultural difference, such as expressed in Maori identity politics. Unchecked, universalism readily slips towards cultural assimilation, which acts as cover for a form of political and philosophical supremacy. To address these imperialist weaknesses is not at all to discard the entire edifice of scientific and academic knowledge, nor to say that it can be replaced by other knowledge, such as Maori knowledge, depending on what we mean by this. So there's a sort of a pushback against universalism, and she's saying, well, universalism leads to more or less assimilation. We're going to lose our identity under universalism, and I just don't think that adds up at all.
It's a very confused argument. I mean, you could have a form of universalism that was like that. By which I mean, it's totalitarianism more than universalism. Like, you have a particular doctrine, be it Nazism or communism, that basically seeks to ruthlessly repress anybody who doesn't subscribe to it, and arguably all this kind of identity politics is morphed into is ironically like that itself. But a universalism, based on, I think, Francis Fukuyama's idea of the broadest possible tent within which everybody can fit and everybody can bring their own ways of being and live together in relative harmony with obvious tensions that will arise from time to time. That's a completely different kind of universalism. That is the universalism of classical liberalism. And the outer limit of the tent is liberalism itself. In other words, the only thing that doesn't fit inside the tent are the forces that want to pull the whole thing down.
Yeah, that's right. I think I just flesh that out with some particular examples, because I think this is the kind of claim that breaks down once you start actually thinking about how the rubber hits the road. So a universalistic claim could be something like everyone has the right to free speech, right? Or it could, in the political sphere, it could be something like that. In the sphere of knowledge or learning, it could be something like 2 + 2 = 4. Now, if you take the one in the political sphere, everyone has the right to free speech. How is that colonizing? Only if you take the view that our culture has to deny people free speech in order to remain our culture, right? And with the epistemic one, or with the sort of more knowledge-based one, saying 2 + 2 = 4 is a universal claim, but it doesn't sort of oppress anybody. It doesn't even stop anyone from saying 2 + 2 = 5. And it only will oppress your culture if you define your culture in this bizarre way that it's incapable of tolerating not only the thought that 2 + 2 = 4, but the right of anybody to say that, right? So most cultures are not like that naturally. And I think that we get ourselves into these strange positions because of some of these claims. I'll just add, like, one thing I do agree with her with at the beginning, though, is when she says something like, relativism is strong to weak. I agree with that in the sense that
that's true.
Everybody's has strong to weak forms. So everybody's a relativist about ice cream flavors, right? Everyone thinks, you can have whatever ice cream flavor you want. If Matthew wants to get lemon flavor, I'm not going to say, but Matthew, chocolate flavor is objectively the best, right? It doesn't make any sense. But obviously, you can also take that too far. There are some things which are not as convincing in terms of, if we take a relativistic view, it's not the case that everyone has a different view about whether 2 + 2 = 4, right?
I mean, this goes back to the work of early anthropologists like Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf. They were studying the idea of linguistic relativism, and it's actually a very interesting field. And Whorf made some fairly strong claims about it based on his study of the Hopi Native American language. In particular, he noted that it didn't use tense in the same way that Indo-European languages tend to, and he contended that meant that Hopi speakers had a fundamentally different experience of the passage of time than, say, English speakers have.
John McWhirter has written a book on this.
Right, yeah, and there's quite a number of books written on it, and it's an interesting idea. There's not a great deal of empirical evidence to back it up, but what did happen is that cognitive psychologists got involved in that debate at some point, and they operationalized it in terms of often color naming. And the reason they used that is that languages vary markedly in the number of categories they have for color, and it can actually be empirically shown that if you speak a language that doesn't make a distinction between what an English speaker would call green and blue, then you actually have a different experience of a measurable difference in the way in which you see green and blue versus an English speaker. And in particular, if we make the distinction between green and blue as we do in English, then you will see any pair of colours that cross that boundary as being more different than you will if you're a speaker of a language that doesn't make that distinction. So that's a pretty weak form of relativism then, but it's one that you can actually gather some real empirical evidence for.
John McWhirter is pretty scathing about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's a bit like the movie Arrival. I don't know, in that movie, the idea is that the way the aliens communicate changes reality. It actually literally changes reality, and so that's the ultimate extension of that. I want to just, if we've got time. Nobody's mentioned strategic essentialism, which I think is a really important point that links phase 2 and phase 3. And Pluckrose and Lindsay do mention at one point. They don't really say very much about it. So strategic essentialism was an idea that Gayatri Spivak, who was one of the post-colonial theorists, came up with. And she said, well, we don't really want to have stereotypes of groups of people. We don't want to sort of say, well, you belong to this race, so you'll be like that. But when it comes to dealing with things like political oppression and so on, we kind of have to be able to make points on a strategic basis. And so she came up with this sort of limited idea of strategic essentialism, which is that, well, we'll use race as a category, or it doesn't even need to be race. It could be any other sort of minority as a category in order to make a strategic point. And I think that's kind of become warped by Kimberly Crenshaw and Judith Butler and so on into intersectionality and standpoint epistemology. And apparently it's not in Cynical Theories, but it is in Yasha Monk's book, and I think it's in Doug Stokes' book as well, that Gayatri Spivak sort of felt that this had been taken too far. And, she said, well, yes, but we shouldn't go overboard with strategic essentialism. So this is another sense in which I think these 3 stages of postmodernism kind of almost warp the previous phase in a way that those people, those theorists and scholars might not actually agree with. So it's the flavor I get from these different books is that where we are today, you could probably say that Derrida and Foucault, probably wouldn't be very happy with the current situation, and wouldn't agree with it. And incidentally, I saw just by a complete coincidence, a YouTube video last night with a guy commenting on the Sokal hoax, which we started talking about. And he read out a quote from Derrida that I hadn't heard, which was kind of much more in sorrow than in anger. And pointing out what I think James had said, that some of the stuff was actually quite playful back in the 1960s.
Certainly Derrida was. Foucault had a pretty serious edge to him, but I think it's a fair point that he wouldn't hold with where all of this has gone.
All right, so that's a good place to end, I think, because you've taken us back to where we began, which was with this sort of playful school of thought, really hardening into a kind of ideology which has now become semi-compulsory for most, if not all, academics. It's kind of an extraordinary...
And primary school children.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing that we've seen happen in our own lifetime. So this book, I think, is, along with the books that Kendall's brought with him and talked about too, is going to help everyone understand it, I think. So I recommend that. Sorry about the live stream, but of course there are too many white men live streaming, so we wanted to contribute to
we had to cancel ourselves from that.
Exactly, yeah. That's why we did it. All right, thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks very much to our participants.
Cheers.